Agatha has always considered herself a woman with an iron will. At the age of 78, she had lived an eventful life and believed that nothing could surprise her anymore. The marriage with her husband lasted for more than 40 years until he passed away 10 years ago. After his death, she was left alone in a large house with 100 memories, an old garden, and photographs on the shelves. She was proud to have raised 2 daughters and seen them become mothers themselves. But now, alone, old age was slowly engulfing her like a fog, creeping into all corners of her mind. Every year her life became more measured and routine. Her grandson Kai sometimes came to her, helped with the house and garden. He was a kind young man, always attentive and caring, despite the fact that his own life was full of events. At the age of 25, Kai was a successful photographer who traveled a lot and rarely stayed in one place. Agatha loved him. He was her joy and comfort, the last ray of light in a life that had long lost all its colors. But everything changed one summer when Kai came for a few weeks to help with the garden and repair the old house. At first, Agatha did not pay attention to the small changes that were happening to her feelings. She blamed it on age, on longing for the past, on loneliness. She had always loved Kai as a grandson, admired him, and was proud of his successes. But this time, something was different. She felt it in his presence, a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness that she couldn't explain. Her heart began to beat faster when he entered the room, and her hands trembled slightly as she prepared food for him. One evening, when Kai was helping her in the kitchen, something changed. Time seemed to slow down. His hand accidentally touched hers as he passed her a vegetable slicer. Agatha froze for a moment, but there was something unusual about this touch. Something warm, almost gentle, slipped through her fingers like an electric charge coursing through her entire body. She pulled her hand away, feeling strangely agitated. It was stupid. It wasn't normal. She is a grandmother, and he is her grandson. How could such thoughts even occur to her? But they came, and they stayed. Told the next day, she found herself staring at him for a long time while he was working in the garden. His strong hands, his confident movements, his smile as he brushed his hair off his face. Everything about him seemed perfect to her. Agatha had never seen him like this before. She tried to convince herself that it was just maternal pride, that she was rejoicing at his success and youth. But something dark began to settle in her heart. Every evening, when they sat at the table and discussed his projects and travels, she felt it more and more. This strange, inexplicable thrill that made her feel like she hadn't felt in years. She noticed that she began to pay more attention to her appearance. Despite her thoughts went back to her youth, to the days when she was beautiful and desirable. These thoughts deepened as she looked at Kai.
What's going on with me?
Agatha thought, standing at the mirror and looking at her wrinkles, which now seemed especially deep to her. She tried to push those thoughts away. She was ashamed. She knew it was wrong. How could a woman her age have such feelings for her own grandson? But every morning, when she saw his smiling face as he hugged her before breakfast, that strange excitement would come back again. One night, she woke up in a cold sweat. She had a dream that she couldn't get out of her head. In this dream, Kai was not just her grandson. He was her lover. In this dream, they walked together through the sunlit garden, holding hands, and everything seemed so right. He kissed her, and she felt young again. When she woke up, her heart was beating as if she had just experienced something real. But it was just a dream, a ridiculous, wrong dream. Nevertheless, this dream haunted her. Throughout the day, her thoughts kept coming back to him. She tried to distract herself by immersing herself in household chores, but nothing helped. Questions began to form in her mind that she was afraid to look for answers to. She tried not to look at Kai for too long, but every time he was around, her thoughts became hazy. Agatha began to avoid him. She was ashamed of the thoughts that were settling in her head. Every time he came to her with questions or helped her around the house, she felt her heart begin to beat faster. Her own body betrayed her. Her mind betrayed her. She tried to keep her distance, but it was useless. He was too close. His presence affected her too much. But one evening, after a long day, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Kai talked about his recent trips, shared stories about the people he met. His voice was calm and confident as always, but Agatha didn't hear the words anymore. She looked at him, at his face, at his eyes, and something inside her broke. She couldn't deny what she was feeling anymore. It was like a curse. She, an old woman, fell in love with her own grandson. She didn't even know how this could happen. It was abnormal, immoral, absurd. But her heart wouldn't listen to her mind. Every time she saw him, her heart skipped a beat. Every time he touched her hand, she felt this strange thrill. And although she understood that these feelings should not have been allowed, they became stronger every day. She began to feel like a prisoner of her own emotions. It became difficult for her to look at Kai. It was difficult to be near him, but it was even more difficult to be away from him. She was torn apart between common sense and this crazy feeling that gripped her. Agatha tried to find an explanation, trying to convince herself that this was just the fruit of her senile loneliness, but none of the explanations calmed her down. Every day her condition became more and more unbearable. Her thoughts about Kai became more and more intrusive. She could no longer find peace day or night. She began to realize that her attraction to him was no longer just a strange feeling. It was a real love, such as she had felt many years ago for her husband. Her mind was full of images of Kai, his smile, his touch. She tried to deal with it, but every time they were alone, her self-control began to crack. Agatha woke up early in the morning, when the first rays of the sun were just beginning to break through the curtains of her bedroom. It was cool in the room, and the silence was so dense that it could almost be felt. But there was no peace or peace inside her. Instead, her mind was filled with thoughts that she was afraid to admit. The dream in which she saw Kai did not leave her alone. These images seemed to haunt her even in reality. She got out of bed and put on a bathrobe, trying to distract herself. Kai was still sleeping in the next room, unaware of the storm that was raging in her head. Agatha knew that this was not normal, that her thoughts were going against the natural order of things. She was ashamed of herself. Every day she spent with him, her feelings only intensified, and it terrified her.
I'm an old woman,
She thought, standing in front of the bathroom mirror. Her wrinkled face and grey hair reminded her of who she really was. She had lived a long life and had long ago come to terms with the fact that love and passion were no longer part of her reality. But now these feelings, which she had thought long buried, awoke in her, like some old demon that had been dormant in the depths of her soul for a long time. She tried to convince herself that all this was just the fruit of her loneliness. She's getting old. Loneliness, longing, memories of youth. All this can make a person feel something strange. It's just physiological, senile. After all, she had lived alone for a long time, and now that Kai had appeared in her life, he had become an anchor for her in this ocean of emptiness. It was her only way to explain what was happening, and although she searched for rational explanations, they did not bring relief. That day, like many others, she and Kai decided to spend time in the garden, pruning bushes and removing old leaves. Kai joked, telling her about his trips and funny moments from his life. Agatha tried to focus on his words, but her attention kept returning to how he looked. His hands, tanned by the sun, moved confidently and deftly as he worked. His smile was warm, sincere, and every little thing reminded her of his youth and strength. She tried to fight these thoughts, to push them away. It was impossible, wrong, immoral. She felt disgusted with herself for allowing herself to think of him in that light. He's her grandson. But her mind betrayed her, returning to these strange, forbidden fantasies over and over again. One evening, after a long day of gardening, they were sitting in the kitchen. Agatha cooked dinner, and they ate in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts. Kai seemed to be completely calm, unaware of the demons tormenting her from the inside. He talked about his plans for the future, about new projects he wanted to start, and that he would have to leave again soon. Agatha listened to him, but her thoughts were far away. She tried not to think about what would happen when he left. Maybe his absence would make it easier for her to fight with herself. After dinner, Kai stood up and thanked her for the meal. His words were ordinary, without a hint of anything unusual. But when he touched her hand to say goodbye before going to his room, the gesture was like lightning. Agatha felt her heart stop and then begin to pound wildly in her chest. He did not notice how her hand trembled, and with a slight smile he left. Agatha sat at the table, not moving, feeling everything inside her turn over. She couldn't deny the truth anymore. What she felt was not just the fruit of loneliness or longing for youth. It was something bigger, deeper, and it scared her to the core. Every day she realized more and more that her attraction to Kai would not disappear by itself. She tried to avoid him, to shorten the time they spent together, but it was all in vain. When he was around, her heart beat faster, and her thoughts became confused. When he was away on his own business, she missed him. She began to realize that she was thinking about him even when he wasn't around. One night, unable to cope with her obsessive thoughts, she went outside. The sky was covered with stars, and the moon softly illuminated the garden. Agatha walked slowly along the path, trying to calm her agitated mind. One seemed to split into two parts. One part told her that this was not normal, that she had to fight with herself, that these feelings would destroy everything she had. But another part, the one that had recently awakened, whispered to her that this feeling could not be ignored so easily. Her struggle with herself was becoming more and more unbearable. At one point, she stopped at an old bench in the garden and sat down on it, burying her face in her hands. She tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. It was too much. She couldn't handle it alone anymore, but at the same time, she couldn't tell anyone how she felt. She was trapped by her own emotions and didn't know how to get out of this trap. The next morning, as usual, Kai went to her kitchen where Agatha was preparing breakfast. He was in a good mood, smiling, joking. But Agatha felt like a stranger in her own home. She felt like she couldn't look at him the same way anymore. His every look, every gesture made her shrink inwardly from conflicting feelings. She decided to distract herself by pretending that everything was as usual. Her tone was even, as it always was when she talked to him, but there was a storm raging inside. She knew she couldn't show him her feelings. It will destroy their relationship. It will destroy her as a person, as a grandmother, as a woman. She could never let Kai know what was going on in her head, but this confession was like a bolt from the blue. She didn't want it. She tried to fight, but her heart betrayed her. Now that the truth stood before her in all its ruthlessness, she had to think about what to do next. She knew she would never be able to reveal her feelings to him, but it was becoming more and more difficult to live with this secret. Every day with him was a torment for her. Every look at his face made her feel pain and guilt. Her struggle with herself had reached its climax. She realized that it was impossible to continue living like this, but she did not know how to find a way out. She hoped that Kai would leave soon, and then his absence would help her cope with these feelings, give herself time to forget about them. But even that did not bring her comfort. Agatha continued to struggle with herself, knowing that her life would never be the same again. Agatha understood that this feeling was growing inside her like a disease, and although she knew that she should never open up to Kai, the fear of her own feelings became her constant companion. After long days of internal struggle and sleepless nights, Agatha sank more and more into the abyss of her feelings. One day, as she sat by the kitchen window, watching the dawn in the garden gently spread its golden blanket over the blooming flower beds, she noticed the first of many signs that would later begin to fill her mind. She couldn't call it something explicit or obvious, but her thoughts suddenly sounded in her head.
This is a sign. It's fate.
At first, she dismissed the idea as a silly obsession, but then something inside her crackled and stirred. Like a long-dormant animal, that day Kai had to leave for the city on business, and Agatha was left alone in the big house. Her loneliness, usually oppressive and suffocating, seemed strangely comforting this time. She walked around the house, trying to distract herself with ordinary things, but every little thing reminded her of Kai. The book he'd left on the living room table, his jacket carelessly thrown over the back of an armchair, his cup left on the kitchen table, everything spoke of him. And every detail seemed important to her, significant, like pieces of a mosaic that add up to one whole picture. During the morning cleaning, she accidentally stumbled upon an old photo album, which she had long ago thrown into the depths of the closet. She didn't remember why she took it out the last time, but today, for some reason, she wanted to open it. Agatha sat down on the sofa and began flipping through the yellowed pages. In each photo, she saw her family, herself, her husband, her daughters. But when she turned the page and saw a picture of Kai, a little boy with a big smile and a shock of brown hair, her heart sank again. It was her grandson, her blood. But why did she see him differently now? Through this strange feeling, the thought arose in Agatha's head.
Maybe it's not just like that.
She tried to brush it off, but the image of Kai wouldn't let her go. It seemed that the world around her began to adjust to her thoughts. Even the photograph she held in her hand seemed to her not just a part of the past, but a kind of symbol confirming her feelings. As the days went on, Kai returned home less and less often. Agatha felt a growing uneasiness, as if her connection with him was fading like a candle in the wind. And yet, despite his absence, she continued to see the signs. One of them happened a few days after that accidental discovery with the photo album. Agatha went out into the garden in the morning to water the flowers. The sky was clear, and a light breeze brought the smells of summer. As she walked along the path, her gaze fell on an old oak tree growing at the end of the garden. This oak has always been a symbol of strength and perseverance for her. But today she noticed something strange. There was an old inscription carved on one of its trunks that she hadn't noticed before. N.A.K. Agatha's heart began to beat faster. It was like a lightning strike.
Agatha and Kai.
She thought. She came closer to examine the inscription. It was probably carved by someone many years ago, but in her head it seemed like something fateful.
Maybe it's a sign.
A thought flashed through my mind. She looked at this carved inscription over and over again, as if she wanted to find hidden meaning in it. Was it really a prediction that had been waiting for her to notice it all this time? Despite her rationality, Agatha couldn't stop thinking about it. She saw such signs around her more and more often. Her mind turned every little thing into something special. The way the candle flame flickered once in the direction where Kai was sitting, as the sun setting over the horizon, threw its last rays on his face. It seemed to her that the world itself was trying to tell her something important that she had ignored for too long. One night she woke up to the fact that she had another strange dream. In this dream, she was standing in front of a mirror in her wedding dress. There were guests around her, and Kai was standing next to her, dressed in an elegant suit. The dream was so real that when she opened her eyes, her heart was still racing and her breathing was uneven. She ran her hand over her forehead, feeling cold sweat. It was just a dream. But why did it seem so real? Why was she seeing this now? When her thoughts were increasingly returning to Kai, she lay in the dark for a long time, trying to figure out what it all meant. Her inner world began to split into two parts. One part screamed that this was crazy, that she had to stop before she went too far. Another part convinced her that all these were signs of fate, that her feelings for Kai were not accidental, that perhaps they were destined by life itself. Over time, Agatha began to attach more and more importance to these signs. She took every incident, every detail as confirmation that her feelings for Kai were not a mistake, but something more. She began to believe that fate was leading her down this path. Even then, when Kai returned after a long absence and thanked her once again for her care and easy conversations, her heart told her that there was something more behind his words. One evening, when Kai was sitting in the living room again, flipping through a book, and Agatha was making tea in the kitchen, she noticed something on the wall that made her stop. It was an old painting that depicted a couple sitting on the porch of a country house. There was love and calmness on their faces. Agatha suddenly realized that the man in the painting reminded her of Kai, and the woman reminded her of a younger version of herself. It seemed like another sign to her. She froze, not knowing how to react to this. It was strange and implausible, but her mind began to put all these signs together. Now everything around her seemed to be part of some great mosaic. In every gesture of Kai, in every word, in every random event, she saw confirmation that her feelings were not a mistake. The certainty grew in her mind that she had to act, that fate itself was telling her what to do. Her inner voice, which had once tried to dissuade her, was now barely audible in the hum of her own thoughts about destiny. Agatha could no longer ignore these signs. They were everywhere. She even began to notice them in small things, in the way raindrops fell on the window forming symbols, or how the moonlight illuminated one part of the house where Kai was sitting. All this created in her head the feeling that the universe was sending her its messages. One evening, when they were sitting on the porch, Kai was telling her about his future plans, and Agatha, looking at him, saw something in his face again, something that she thought she hadn't noticed before. This was another sign that couldn't be ignored, and although she knew that her feelings contradicted all logic and morality, her consciousness now firmly convinced her that all this was predetermined. Her struggle with herself continued, but now it was getting harder to deny the obvious. Agatha stood at the window, watching Kai work in the garden. Summer had come into its own, and the midday sun flooded the site with bright light. His figure moved confidently and calmly, as always. Youth, strength, agility, everything about him seemed perfect, and every step he took seemed to confirm what she had long ago decided for herself. Their bond was more than just a family bond. She no longer doubted that all those signs that she saw around her were an indication that fate was leading her on the right path. The inner voice that had been insistently whispering to her that this was madness was now almost silent. Every step she took towards Kai was now dictated by something more than just desire. It was a duty to herself, to that new, awakened woman who was hiding inside her. She began her attempts at rapprochement with the little things. At first, it was just an extension of the time they spent together. She found excuses to be with him more often. For example, that evening, when he was working at the site, she went out into the garden, ostensibly to water the flowers, but in fact her hands were clutching a hose with water, just so that she could surreptitiously watch him. She was standing nearby, and his every gesture caused her a strange excitement. Her heart skipped a beat when, unaware of her gaze, he raised his head to the sky, brushed his hair from his face, or bent down to the ground to grab something. She could feel the feeling that she had been suppressing for so long burning up inside her. The next day, Agatha decided to cook his favorite dish, something that Kai had adored since childhood. She spent several hours in the kitchen, lovingly cooking everything, trying to make everything perfect. Her hands were shaking as she cut vegetables and watched the pots, but this excitement was not from fatigue. It was from the fact that she was cooking not just a meal, but a gesture. It was the beginning of her journey towards getting closer to him. She was looking for any opportunity to show him her concern, and this was her first attempt. The dish was ready. Agatha, with a tremor in her heart, served it on the table. She watched Kai enjoying his meal without saying a word. He was smiling, and his smile was like a reward for her. Her heart fluttered with joy when he ate, not even suspecting that all this had a hidden meaning for her. Every bite he took seemed to her to be proof that she was moving in the right direction. In her mind, it wasn't just a family dinner. It was the first link in a chain of events that she believed would lead them to something more. Fortune, but it wasn't enough. The inner fire that was burning in her demanded more. She began to find new reasons to be closer to him all the time. She offered to help him in the garden, even when he politely tried to refuse. Her hands involuntarily reached out to his as she handed him the tools, her fingers lingering on his arm a little longer than necessary. They were small, almost imperceptible gestures, but to her, they were full of meaning. She longed to feel his closeness, that fleeting contact that told her more than any words. Agatha began to pay attention to how Kai spends his time in the house. He liked to sit in the living room in the evenings, immersed in his books or laptop, doing his projects. She used to leave him alone, believing that he had his own life and his own interests. But now she was attracted to him with such force that she could no longer stay away. She came into the room under the pretext of something insignificant, to pour herself tea, to straighten the cushions on the sofa. But in fact, she just wanted to be there. She sat nearby, pretending to read a newspaper or embroider, but her thoughts were only about every time he was in the room. Her presence became more and more noticeable. She could feel the invisible bond she had instilled between them. It was a game of silence that only she played. She searched his eyes, watched the way he moved, the way he breathed. Sometimes it seemed to her that he too felt something unusual, that he too noticed her presence. But Kai remained calm, immersed in his own affairs, unaware that a real storm was going on in her heart. Every day her desire to get closer to him became more and more obvious to herself. Agatha began to notice how her own actions were becoming more and more intrusive. As they walked through the garden, she began to slow down, trying to walk closer to him. Her hand sometimes accidentally touched his arm as they walked side by side. They were subtle gestures, but each one was like a new attempt for her to overcome the barrier that existed between them. She wanted him to notice her, to see her differently. But at the same time, she was afraid that he would understand everything that was going on in her head. Her attempts to get closer to Kai also included more and more small gifts. She began to give him things that she thought should remind him of her. These were small but significant things for her: books in which she left her notes in the margins, objects that reminded her of her youth. These gifts were a way for her to strengthen their bond, to make it more tangible. She also began to pay attention to his appearance. Every time he came back from the street, she noticed how his skin glistened in the sun, how his hair was slightly disheveled by the wind. She felt strangely excited when he came to dinner dressed in his usual casual clothes. But to her, it looked like he was deliberately trying to impress her. Everything was forming a logical chain in her head. All these moments, gestures, glances, these were signs that told her that he might also feel something special. But despite all her attempts, despite all the moments she was trying to create, there was still an invisible wall between them. Kai remained unchanged, kind and caring, but he still saw her as his grandma. This feeling of disappointment gradually began to penetrate her soul, but Agatha did not give up. She kept trying, kept looking for new ways to be closer to him. One evening, she decided to arrange something special for him. She remembered how many years ago, when she was young, her husband would arrange romantic candlelit dinners for her. These memories gave her an idea. She decided to recreate something similar for Kai. She spent the whole day cooking a special dinner, placing candles all over the house, creating an atmosphere that she thought was supposed to show him her true feelings. When Kai returned home tired after a long day, he was surprised by what he saw. The house was lit by soft candlelight, and the dishes she had prepared for him were already on the table. Agatha was sitting at the table, trembling in her heart, waiting for him to join her. This dinner was supposed to be the culmination of all her efforts, her attempt to show him how she felt. But something went wrong. Despite all her efforts, Kai remained the same as always. He thanked her for dinner and smiled, but there was nothing in his eyes that she had hoped to see. He saw in this gesture only a manifestation of her care, her love as a grandmother, and not as a woman. This moment was a crushing blow for her. She put her whole soul and all her feelings into this dinner, but Kai did not notice anything that went beyond the usual care. Agatha felt her world crumbling. All the signs she had seen before, all her attempts to get closer to him, seemed pointless to her now. Agatha was sitting in her room with her head in her hands. Her whole world seemed about to collapse. After the dinner she had arranged for Kai, the hopes she had been building collapsed with a bang, leaving her alone with a painful feeling of emptiness. She knew that something had gone wrong, that despite all her efforts, Kai still saw her only as a grandmother, and this realization burned her like poison, spreading through her veins and turning her dreams into pain. The days have passed since the ill-fated dinner. Agatha watched Kai, trying to catch the slightest hint of a change in his behavior, but everything was the same. Kai remained as kind, caring and attentive as ever. He spent time with her, helped her around the house, but there was the same intangible wall between them that destroyed her dreams. She tried to convince herself that it was just a misunderstanding, that he needed time to process her feelings, but deep down she knew that Kai couldn't feel for her the way she felt. Her mind, already exhausted by the struggle with her own thoughts, began to be burdened by this constant tension. Every time they were in the same room together, it seemed to her that the air around her was compressed, making her breathing heavy and unbearable. She tried to suppress this feeling, but it was getting stronger every day. Her inner voice, which had been whispering to her for so long about destiny and the signs of fate, now sounded with renewed vigor. He kept telling her that she had to act, that there's no point in procrastinating anymore. Her heart sank every time she looked at Kai. Her feelings, which had previously seemed strong but hidden to her, were now like a volcano about to erupt. She couldn't fight it anymore. The idea arose in her mind that the only way out was to open up to him, admit her feelings, put everything on the line. The thought terrified her, but at the same time gave her hope that it would finally free her from the yoke she had worn for so long. Maybe he'll understand, she thought. Maybe he'll see me differently. And one evening, when the sun was already setting, Agatha made a decision. This day was the culmination of all her thoughts, fears, and desires. She knew she couldn't hide her feelings anymore. If she didn't do it now, she would forever remain a prisoner of her unfulfilled fantasies. She could no longer live in the shadow of these emotions. Kai was in the living room, going about his business as usual. His gaze was focused on the laptop screen, but Agatha saw something defiantly familiar in his calmness. Her heart started beating faster when she entered the room. She took a few steps towards him, feeling her legs grow heavy and her body tense. The air in the room seemed thick and heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had compressed around her, making it difficult to breathe. She stood not far from him, in silence. Kai, not noticing her presence, continued to work, but her silence became so palpable that he finally raised his head and looked at her. Agatha felt something break inside her. Her gaze met his, and at that moment she realized that she could no longer remain silent. All those feelings that she had suppressed for so long were now bursting out, filling her mind, her heart, her body. Without saying a word, she took a step toward him, slowly and carefully, as if she was afraid to scare away reality itself. Kai looked at her with mild bewilderment, not understanding what was going on. He was used to seeing her calm, caring, but now there was something strange in her eyes, something he hadn't expected. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached him, and her breathing became uneven. She paused for a moment as if gathering her strength, and then at that moment, she reached out and touched his shoulder. It wasn't just a touch, it was a recognition embodied in a gesture. Her fingers slowly slid over his arm, as if she was trying to convey all her feelings to him through one touch. In her mind, the gesture seemed important and deep to her, like a bridge between them. She couldn't hide her emotions anymore. It was her only way to express all that she was experiencing. Kai froze. His gaze became more serious. He didn't understand what was going on, but there was tension in his eyes. He sensed something strange in her gesture, but he couldn't figure out what it was. 1,000 thoughts flashed through his mind, but none of them were close to what was actually going on in Agatha's head. She continued to stand in front of him silently, but her inner world was engulfed by a storm. Her hands were now slowly moving towards his face, as if she was trying to keep in contact with him for as long as possible. There was pleading, desire, fear in her eyes, all mixed up into one huge feeling that she could no longer contain. She hoped that he would feel it, that he would understand her without words. It was her moment of truth, but Kai suddenly retreated. His face turned pale and his eyes widened. He felt something wrong in her touch. He tried to pull away, but she held out her hand to him again, as if she was afraid she would lose this moment if he moved too far away. The silence in the room became unbearable. She hung in the air like a thick blanket that made it difficult to breathe. Agatha knew that something had gone wrong. His withdrawal, his reaction, all indicated that her hopes were being dashed. She didn't know how to react to his backward movement, to his cold gaze. Her heart clenched in the grip of fear and despair, but she didn't stop. Her hands were shaking as she tried to touch him again. The same voice kept ringing in her head, telling her that it was all right, that this was her chance. She couldn't let it end like this. But Kai took another step back. His expression had changed. There was not just bewilderment in it now, but something else as well. Something deeper. Shock. He turned abruptly and left the room, leaving Agatha standing where she was. She didn't move. Her body seemed to turn to stone. She knew that all was lost. All her efforts, all the signs she believed in, turned out to be just an illusion. Kai didn't understand her. He didn't feel what she was trying to convey to him. The room was plunged into a dead silence. Agatha stood there, feeling her heart slowly cool down. The moment she'd been dreading and waiting for at the same time had passed, but instead of relief, she felt only emptiness. Her hopes were shattered, her fantasies crumbled to dust. The silence in the house was thick, like a woolen blanket that pressed down on every space. All those feelings that filled Agatha have now disappeared, leaving only emptiness and powerlessness. Her attempt to confess her feelings, her last desperate steps to get closer to Kai, all failed. He left without saying a word, leaving her alone in this cold room, where every object, every corner now reminded her of the pain and shame she felt. Agatha slowly sank into a chair, her hands trembling, as did her whole body. The sudden realization of what she had done came to her with devastating force. Her inner world, which had seemed so stable despite all the madness, was now falling apart. All those signs, all those moments that she took for predestined, turned out to be just her fantasies, created by her mind, which could no longer distinguish between reality and delusion. Her heart was beating slowly and heavily, as if every pulse was giving off pain all over her body. She tried to figure out what had happened, but her thoughts were tangled like threads that had come together in one tight ball. She couldn't believe that she had gone so far as to allow herself to believe something so absurd. Her life, her existence, seemed meaningless to her now. Agatha couldn't sleep that night. Her head was filled with thoughts of Kai, of how he must have looked at her with horror and incomprehension. She no longer saw in front of her the grandson she had once loved as her own. Now all that remained of their relationship was overshadowed by her own crazy feelings, and the thought was killing her from the inside out. Kai, meanwhile, wandered around the house, avoiding rooms where Agatha might be. After her touch, after he felt that something deeply wrong had happened, he couldn't stay in her presence. It seemed to him that the air in the house had become heavy, suffocating. Every detail, every little thing now reminded him of what had happened. It was hard for him to breathe, hard for him to think. He couldn't understand how this could happen. Everything that seemed so simple and clear before has now become complicated, confusing and terrifying. He sat in his room trying to collect his thoughts. His gaze was fixed on the wall, but his mind was far beyond the room. Agatha, his grandmother, a woman he had known all his life, a woman who always took care of him and was an example of love and kindness for him. She was someone else to him now. He felt like he couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Her touch, her looks. Now it all seemed alien and frightening to him. He couldn't stay here. This thought was as clear as any other. Kai realized that he had to leave. The sooner the better. He could no longer be near Agatha. Her presence caused him anxiety that he could not overcome. He needed to leave, to sort himself out, to figure out how to move on after all this. Early in the morning, when the house was still asleep, Kai began to pack his things. He moved silently, trying not to make any noise so as not to wake Agatha. He knew that if their eyes met again, he would not be able to bear it. He quickly packed his things, leaving only those items in the house that no longer mattered to him. Every single thing he touched now seemed to be imbued with a strange energy left over from that evening. He had to leave this place, otherwise he wouldn't be able to breathe. Agatha, although she did not see his actions, felt that something was changing. She hadn't slept all night, and her thoughts were racing between fear and despair. She knew that Kai would not be able to forgive her. She realized that their relationship would never be the same again. It was her own fault. She had taken the first step towards destroying what had once bound them, and now all was lost. When Kai left the house, Agatha went to the window and saw his departing figure. He walked at a brisk pace, with a bag over his shoulder, without looking back. She watched him, feeling her heart clench with pain. She wanted to say something, wanted to stop him, but she couldn't. Her voice was suppressed inside her. Her body was as if paralyzed. She knew this was the end of everything they had. Kai reached the car, got into it and drove away. The house fell silent again, and this silence was the last blow for Agatha. Now she was all alone. Kai left, and with him went her last hope that things might be different. Now she understood that her feelings were an illusion caused by loneliness and longing for the past. She had let her emotions take over her mind, and now she was paying the price. Days passed, and then weeks. Agatha could no longer enjoy the silence in the house. Every corner of this house reminded her of Kai, of those moments that she considered important, but which, in fact, were just a figment of her imagination. Her life turned into an endless cycle of repetitions. She got up in the morning, cooked herself a modest breakfast, then sat in an armchair by the window, watching the garden, which had seemed alive to her before, but now became empty and lifeless. Her mind kept returning to thoughts about what was wrong in her life. She thought for a long time about her youth, about what she had lost, about how her life was trapped in loneliness and despair. She tried to find answers, but she couldn't find them. All she had left was a painful sense of loss. Her health began to deteriorate. She rarely left the house. Her strength was fading every day. She didn't see the point of her existence anymore. Kai didn't contact her anymore, and she understood that. She understood that he had left forever, never to return. He was the last thread that connected her to life, but now it's broken too. One morning, Agatha just didn't wake up. The sun rose over her house again as it always did, but she didn't see it anymore. Her heart stopped in silence, like her whole life, leaving behind only the memories of what she could never fix.